certain fact at one time in history, now we laugh at it. And that span between thinking something is absolutely true and thinking it's ridiculous is getting shorter and shorter and shorter as history and science move on. So there were a lot of things that I believed because they taught it to me in school that by the time I was done with college, I didn't believe at all. Interestingly, that brought my faith in God to be very strong, whereas when I started college, it was pretty weak. I know a lot of people have a different experience with that, but that was mine. And with that, people argue over whether or not you should understand the world and then come to the conclusion that God exists from that, or whether or not you should start with the existence of God and come to the conclusion about understanding the world. And really, both ways have their own strengths and weaknesses, right? But at the end of the day, you should be able to look at the world and know that God did everything in it and that he did it well. In other words, everything that exists is evidence for the existence of God. And God's the basis for knowing anything about just about anything else. So if I can get this to go. So I'm going to go over just 10 recent things that have come up. We'll try to be quick, but I've only got 347 slides, so it won't take that long. So first, geological time. We usually think of time as this thing having to do with our own consciousness, right? But really, there's different ways to look at time. If you're talking about from the beginning of the universe and you think that happened 50 billion years ago, you're using a different word when you talk about time rather than what time are we going to get out of here? I'm already ready for lunch. It's a different thing, right? Well, geological time is a little bit different too. So here is the dominant interpretation and theory of how we got the world that we got today. It's called Pangea. Now here's the idea. All of the continents on Earth were at one time touching each other. In other words, South America was touching Antarctica and Africa. Europe was touching the United States. Asia, you could walk from one end of the world, and if you walk long enough, walk to the others. Here's the thing. Just about everybody agrees that all of these places were touching each other at one time. None of this is contrary to a Christian understanding of these things. Because, if you look in the middle there, where Africa is touching South America, all of the rocks line up, all of the fossils line up, all the different types of life and flora and fauna line up all the way down that line, so that it's very possible for even the Christian to understand that when God created the earth, that possibly there was one landmass. But also, did you know that the dominant theory up until pretty recently was that the earth expands and contracts? You might never have thought about this, but for a couple of hundred years, it was the dominant view. Now, what do we call the theory that the continents are moving around? Continental drift, right? So that's the dominant theory, that they're just drifting around up there. They came from this, but then they all started moving around to the places that they're at today. Well, we all understand that matter expands and contracts with when it's hot and when it's cool, right? And we all understand that the earth has been cooler in some times and hotter at other times. So it's very reasonable, scientifically speaking, to think that the earth might have been a little bigger or smaller at different times in its development. Because 3/4 of the earth's surface is covered with water. That's most of it, right? That's 75% covered with water. How much would the earth have to contract for the entire land mass and surface of the earth to be underwater? How much smaller would it have to get? 50%? Not that much, right? Less than 3% would cover the entire surface of the earth, except for the highest mountains, which, as we know, mountains get taller and shorter with time. It happens all the time. The mountains that are the tallest in the world now were not the mountains that were the tallest in the world 1,000 and 2,000 years ago, and that's very recent in our history. So all of these things are changing. Here's another interpretation of what the continents were probably like early in our history. Now, people say that this was 4 billion years ago. There's not really a lot of reason to believe that time scale unless we believe that we have to use this model. Everything that exists exploded billions of years ago, and stuff just happened, and if there's a slow natural process for it all to happen, then it would have had to happen that long ago. But other than that, there's no real evidence that the universe and the earth didn't begin 10,000 years ago or less. Now, here's why we think it did, right? Because we think we have to have a model in which everything that's changing now, everything has always been changing in this way. But there's not a rational basis for that. That's a faith statement about how you think universes form. Now, you know that until 50, 60 years ago, they were still arguing about whether or not the universe had always existed or whether or not it burst into existence from a bang, right? Now, right now, the dominant thing is it all came into existence by a bang. But that's fading fast. More and more people are going back to that solid state thing where the universe and all the stars were just out there forever. It's completely irrational, and yet at the same time, it seems to be coming to dominate the sciences. You really can't have things like stars that burn energy, kind of like gas in a gas tank, and just have them there forever. But, you know, we got to believe something, right? And here's kind of the world that we have today. So the idea that there was an actual flood that covered the entire earth is very reasonable. At the same time, that the entire earth might have at one time been dominated by land masses is also possible, which is why when we go out and we look for things, when people are hunting treasure these days, do they do it on the land? They do it under the ocean. And where do they try to find under the ocean in order to find those treasures is buildings. Ancient civilizations under the surface is what's the main key to finding treasure. In case you think this is just like my theory, this is an article from Scientific American, very secular and respected scientific journal. The expanding and contracting Earth idea is coming back because it's kind of necessary to explain the features of the Earth that we have now. If you know within reason almost for sure that Africa and South America and North America were touching at one time, if the rocks kind of stop here and then you have an indenture and they pick up again when you get to Africa and they all fit together like a puzzle anyway, you have to have some kind of a way of explaining how that happened. Now, did it happen over billions of years or did it happen over a weekend? That's a different question. And some people will say, well, it can't have happened over a weekend. Well, you know, then how long does that take exactly? If God, being God, takes the whole earth and he breaks it into pieces and stretches it out and remakes it, how long exactly does that take? How long does it take to say, let there be light, and light comes forth? It's an interesting thing, but if the earth expands and contracts, the entire mechanism for a worldwide flood and the age of the earth changes. Here's some of the ways it changes. We get into Wegener's theory of continental drift and the way these different things fit together. If you look there in that picture, you can see a different configuration of how they dominated each other at time. This also explains why certain animals exist on all the continents. We usually go to what? The Ice Age and ice shelves and stuff like that, and they had to walk over those things. Now, I believe in an ice age. I just don't believe in a 10,000-year ice age because it doesn't take that long to walk over stuff, right? How do we get the different human beings on every continent and island basically on Earth? A lot of these animals must obviously have been riding continents because you just can't get them to places like Australia through any other mechanism. So unless you're going to say the animals were there 4 billion years ago when Australia broke off, you have to have some kind of a mechanism for having animals that are on the other continents be on that continent. Or they're just great swimmers. They're all great swimmers, right? So in geological time, Earth science is watching it happen in real time. Every once in a while, God gives us a weird gift where he explains how things actually work. Now, who knows what this is? This is Mount St. Helens in our very recent history. And it's a mountain. It's also a volcano, but almost all of the mountains are volcanoes. Some of them, the lava is just deeper, but mountains can come up in a relatively short amount of time, and they can recede with time. As a matter of fact, all of the mountains are just banding and a crushing together of earth and tectonic plates and volcanic forces, squishing them together just like a tablecloth on a table as you move it back and forth. That's what the mountains are, right? And so this thing blew up. How many of you remember it? All the kids are like, what's Mount St. Helens? And everybody else remembers because it affected the entire country. They had ash coming down in Maine all the way from the state of Washington, Oregon. Washington. So this thing blew up with the force of many atomic bombs. It blew up and it sent ash thousands and thousands of feet in the air that covered many, many states. 16 states felt the immediate effect of the explosion. And of course, as happens with volcanoes, what happens? Stuff comes out, right? So it not only affected the immediate area, it affected everything within thousands of miles, permanently. Have you guys ever seen these kind of features? Like, how many of you have been to Grand Canyon? And you've seen the different layers, right? We've got different names for those layers. Some of the layers are very big. They go over several states. They go for 1,000 miles in a different direction, right? But we've got layers, and so you're able to say, this one is from 315 million years ago, this one is from 300 million years ago, this one is from 200 million years ago, this one's from 150 million years, and you just count the layers up, right? How long did it take for all of these different layers to form? Yeah, they said 34 minutes, right? And they're different colors, and there's different layers. Here's the thing about volcanoes. They do not care about your geology test, right? Every once in a while, a volcano goes crazy and starts spitting out gold and diamonds. It has happened in history, right? All the precious gems and stones that we have, they're all the result of volcanic activity, and volcanoes and the pressures and the heat and the lava, they can spray out all that stuff. You remember the gold rush that happened in California? Where they would look for a certain kind of sand and a certain kind of dirt, and then they would follow it to a place, and they'd find some little pieces of gold, and they'd follow that up the river until they found what? A gold strike, just a strip of gold through the earth, especially around granite and that kind of stone. Why does that form there? Well, nobody knows. How long does it take for it to form? 15 or 20 minutes. Now, you might say to yourself, well, it would obviously take 50 million years for that gold to form. Through what mechanism? Because if you could find out, you would be the richest person on earth. We have no idea through what mechanism lead or uranium or these things turn into gold. Nobody knows, plutonium, any of these. But if you start digging around a volcano, you have a much greater odds of finding precious gems and different kinds of things. Here's one of the things they tend to find that they don't want to find, plutonium and uranium, because they will kill you if you find them and take them home, right? So they've learned to be very careful about these things, but it happens very quick. Here's another place. How old is this? Now, if you're just looking, you might say to yourself, that looks like a 200-300 million year old. This also formed in about 6 hours at Mount St. Helens. Look at the different layers, the different structures, the different kinds of earth. You've got sandstone, you've got granite, it's all there. It has to be millions of years old. Didn't they ever take you on a field trip when you were in school? So these are the kind of things that started to wear on me and break me down when I was in college, you know, because I was being expected to believe things without reasonable evidentiary findings and not believe things that seemed blatantly obvious, like, you know, none of this land was here. Where these people are standing here, also, where they're standing would have been about 120 feet in the air before the explosion. None of this was there 50 years ago. So, is it new? It's brand new, right? But it's certainly not hundreds of millions of years old. Here's another one. It's even got this beautiful waterfall. It's so nice, right? None of this was there 50 years ago. What about that, though? That's got to be hundreds of millions of years old. Look how beautiful it is. And there's a canyon, and there's a river going down the canyon. And all of this would have been hundreds of feet in the air 50 years ago. None of this land was here. So, you know, you start to think in terms of the Grand Canyon and stuff like that. Are there mechanisms that can form those things quickly? Or do you have to have a river? And do you have to wait 100 million years for this river to carry away tiny little grains of sand? And eventually all the layers fall on top of each other, and eventually you have mountains and canyons. We've never seen that happen. You have to understand, we've never seen that happen anywhere on Earth. We've seen this happen. Anybody remember Krakatoa? It used to be a large island in the middle of the ocean. One day it blew up, now there's no more island. That's the way the earth changes stuff when it wants to change it. Anybody remember this one? That actually is the Grand Canyon. But the reason that you're skeptical is that it does have the same features that occurred within a few hours at Mount St. Helens. 6 hours. Now this is bigger. Obviously it's bigger. But likeness in formation doesn't deny likeness in scale. In other words, it can be bigger or smaller, but the mechanism has to be somewhat the same. This didn't happen over 2 or 3 billion years. This probably happened, frankly, over a weekend. Here's another one. Is this the Grand Canyon or is this Mount St. Helens? This is Mount St. Helens. This happened over a 12-hour period. All the stuff that came down and rested upon the land, mainly in the form of ash and water and stuff being sprayed out of the volcano, because it was wet and there was a whole river there and a lake, when it receded, it left all these canyons in one day. But there's differences in color and difference in shape, and well, you know, Earth does that. Some of it's heavier than others. The heavier ones go down and the lighter ones go up, and there was thousands of trees, and it affects the coloration. But this is not the Grand Canyon. This is Mount St. Helens. If you go there now, it's all covered with grass. So there's also civilizational time, the way we measure civilizations. Anybody want to take a guess as to what this is? This is the way that this place looked when it was found or discovered in 1919. It's become one of the most famous sites in the world for an ancient civilization. Now, what is said now is that we've measured it all, and it could only have existed within the last 500 years. But frankly, they found it, and most of it was under 30 to 40 feet of dirt, and they excavated it for the last 100 years to make it look very different. What about this one? Anyone recognize it now? Here's the thing. It's a city that's up on top of a mountain. And they said that it was discovered, especially by the conquistadors that they came in, that conquered it and drove the people out. No, there's no evidence, there's no dead bodies, there's no weapons, there's nothing there, there's no graves. And yet at the same time, okay, here's the thing. How many of you dust regularly? We are not dusters, right? We dust with, fannies and books. That's how we dust, right? But how long would it take for 30 or 40 feet of dust to accrue? Could it be done over 500 years? Hypothetically possible if you had some kind of mechanism for that. But here's what it looks like today, because they've been digging it for 100 years. Machu Picchu, right? The mechanism also for building it seems to be of a construction that none of the people that are claimed to have built it really understood. In other words, we know a lot about the Incas, and we know a lot about the Aztecs, and we know a lot about the different groups. But whoever built this seems to have been a different group because they used methodologies and architecture that were not common or known at the time in the place. Are there any other peoples that have built stuff with rocks? Everybody on Earth. Now, a commonness in methodology tends to lead to a commonness in learning or background. There are other places on the earth that built similar things, just not these people at this time. Here's another picture of it now. It doesn't look like it did 100 years ago, right? How much digging do you think it took to make it look like this rather than what it looked like when they found it? And how did it get under 30 to 40? Now, here's the thing. You're going to hear a common claim because this comes up all the time. Here's the common claim. They buried it on purpose to keep the conquerors from finding it. So you had like 100,000 people with wicker baskets of dirt climbing up the mountain, pouring it on this incredibly huge city that probably had 5,000 to 10,000 people living in it, just to keep people from finding it. Yeah. So here's the thing. In the most strange circumstances that we find on earth, the idea of a biblical flood that swept through the earth and buried entire civilizations and wiped those people out gets more and more credible when you actually look at the evidence, rather than just dismissing offhand that such a thing is not possible. The only thing that we usually find that buries entire cities in sediment is either volcanic or water catastrophe. Those are the two things. There's no evidence anywhere around here of there being a volcanic catastrophe. Because you can tell where you get ash from. You can pick up ash on the ground in America and you can say, this came from Hawaii. You can literally measure the chemicals and the molecules within it and their radioactivity, and you can find out where it's from. This isn't the way this was buried. It was buried with the dirt from around there. You want to ask a question? I don't know about that kind of data for this specific place and this specific time. Mostly, they didn't find anything. They didn't find evidence of human habitation at all, which is extraordinarily unnerving, right? They didn't find anybody who built this. So also to say that it's 500 years old is just, it's just a random guess. They're just kind of saying it because they don't even know who built the thing. But people go see it all the time. I don't know if any of you have been there. It's a fascinating thing. Yeah. This past week. Yeah. So, even some scientists have gone as far as to say, how long would it take to bury this so that nobody could find it under the earth? And one guy, he was no Christian, but he just starts popping off. He says, through the means they had available, 11,000 years. And that was not a Christian argument. He's just saying baskets, carrying dirt up and walking up the mountain. And yeah. Okay, anybody want to take a guess as to what this is? This is Mycenae, Greece. Notice, though, the similarity in the architecture and the structure and the materials used. When you think about the ancient world and you think about the biblical narrative, and you think to yourself, it's just supposed to be mythology, we're not really supposed to take it as true. Here are some things about the biblical narrative that you should take into account. Number one, man, when he was created, from the very beginning, was already smart. He had never been a monkey. There were no millions of years of development for the monkey to get smart enough to shave and put on a nice suit, right? So man comes into the world, he's immediately intelligent, and the next few lines of the Bible say things like, then they discovered technology, then they started to build things, then they started to make great cities. It happens like that in the Bible. Really, do you remember when you were in school and they told you there was no civilizational context before 4000 BC? The pyramids are the oldest things that exist on Earth. There was nothing before that. Before, everybody was just monkeys. Within the last 20 or 30 years, all of that has been completely destroyed. Nobody in the sciences believes that anymore. The reason why is because civilization happened quick, and people were immediately smart, and they didn't necessarily immediately start having smart watches and stuff, but they started to build cities immediately. On every continent on Earth, you find these cities and entire civilizations buried beneath the earth. Why couldn't we find it before? I'm going to tell you the truth. There weren't enough shovels. Probably think I'm joking, but think about it. You guys especially, when's the last time you dug a hole? Was it fun? Did you have a good time? Did you invite your friends over and you all had a beer and some pizza and dug a hole? Nobody wants to dig a hole with you, just like if you have a truck. You always have to avoid all your friends, right? Because they all want to borrow your truck. Digging a hole is one of the hardest things around. But how are we finding all these cities now? Well, LiDAR and satellites and Google Earth. There are 50 channels on YouTube that all they do is have these guys that are finding ancient sites using Google Earth. And then they go to it and they make a little video. Sometimes they can't figure out what it is, but they figure out that there was entire castles and things like that there. Well, also, in South America, there were civilizations bigger than the corresponding civilizations in Europe at the time the conquistadors came. They found them all now, right? And they see them all beneath the level of the sand. They're there, but they're buried. This gets even weirder. Is this Mycenae, Greece? Looks very similar, but no, this is also Machu Picchu. You can see the mountain in the background, but see that the construction is the same because all of these people came from a common people and spread over the earth. That's why their construction and their knowledge and their architecture are similar. Sometimes their art is different. Sometimes you can tell South American art from Greek art, from different civilizations' art, right? But can't you today? You can do that in Memphis, right? You don't have to go far for that. This one, anybody want to guess? Also Peru. Also Peru. Look at the size of those rocks. This is one of the most fascinating areas of this. They have no idea how these people moved those rocks. But one thing they know is in the high culture of the Aztecs and the Incas, in which they built Tenochtitlan and some of the most amazing structures that still exist. You can go within a few miles of Mexico City, you can find pyramids that rival the pyramids in Egypt. They're just not as famous, right? But they're there. But you also see this. And this is not generally spoken about. So what we tend to find in history is the same idea we find in the Bible. And this will make you very disturbed because this is post-apocalyptic. I don't know how many of you have watched, what's that zombie show? The Living Dead, right? Well, I'm not going to talk about zombies. That's not the point. The point is it's post-apocalyptic, and people like the idea that what are we going to do after this civilization fails? Well, the Bible story is one in which civilization and technology and building of cities thrived immediately and then was completely wiped out. And we've been coming back from that ever since. Is that what we actually see? So the Incas and the Aztecs did not actually know how to build these things. You see their things, and the carvings are intricate, and the art and the astronomical sciences are there, but they could never move these kind of rocks or build these kind of things, and they didn't know who did. They just moved into them. So what you often find is different levels of society where people move into things that already existed and they build on top of it. We find that again and again, especially in the ancient world. This is from a place called Baalbek in Lebanon, and on top of it you find what the Romans and the Greeks built. But the Romans and the Greeks could never build with these bricks that are on the bottom because some of them weigh over 200 tons. And we still don't know the mechanism for how they moved them in the first place. Now, some of you are immediately going to go, it's those aliens. I watched Joe Rogan. He straightened me out. It's the aliens did it. And I always think to myself, if aliens came here on spaceships from a different galaxy and traveled light years and they've got all these abilities and all they did was come and move rocks and stuff, it's a bad plan. It's a bad plan. I think this is very human, but it's kind of obvious that the people in the high civilizations of the Greeks and the Romans did not know how to do what the previous generations that did not survive knew how to do. How much does a jumbo jet weigh? Anybody want to guess? Probably, here's the thing. I knew this guy, Denny knew him also in law school. He was a genius. His name was Devron Byerly, and he used to quiz me on weird stuff like this, and I'd always get it wrong. Because here's the thing. None of us know, right? But when they ask that question in like a job interview, they know if you have any idea. If you say it's 1 ton, okay, you're wrong. But if you say it's 5 million tons, you're just as wrong. It's in the 50 to 70 tons area. You have to know how much one weighs if you're going to get a job, in that area. Well, 200 tons of block is a lot of tons of block. There's this ancient philosopher who wrote in about 500 BC who said they used the mastodons. Now, what usually happens is people laugh at that. Oh, the mastodons. Did you know that all through the ancient Greek and Roman histories, they talk about using the mastodons to do things? Because mastodons are just hairy elephants that are bigger. It's not really that different. They're still alive today. They're just smaller and hairless because they're from Africa and Asia. But even in their armies, they used to usually have some. And we think of mastodons as being something that died out hundreds of thousands of years ago, but that's because of the mythology. Really, they died out a couple of thousand years ago, and the Romans used to use them for different projects. So civilizational time, archaeology, and South American ancestry come into this. Here's an ancient map of one of the cities that they apparently found. This would be modern-day Mexico City. Notice that it's surrounded by water. Now, this is historically attested. Still today, I think is it the third biggest city on earth now? Mexico City? Anyway, there's a lot of people there. And if they did not keep all of the pumps running and the drainage going regularly, it would all be under the water within a short amount of time. It's in a depression, and there's a lot of water around there. But it was a beautiful city surrounded by lakes and water, and most of the houses were on there. Within 20 miles of it is this structure, which was built for the ancient civilizations. But I believe this was the ancient South American civilization. So I don't see the features of what we usually find in a pre-flood civilization. So this is enormous. There's only one historic. Now, all we mean by historic is when we started writing. Anything before we started writing is prehistoric. It doesn't mean it was that long ago. But of the historic buildings, the only bigger thing on Earth is the pyramids in Egypt, right? Doesn't it look like one of them? Do you think there's any chance that these civilizations actually touched at some point in the past? I mean, I know those South American monkeys couldn't have met the African monkeys that we came from. But maybe at one point, all of these people were together with similar backgrounds and technology. Another thing about the Bible's narrative is, y'all are related. Every one of you. And with the new changes in DNA, it's becoming very uncomfortable for some people. The center and birthplace of civilization is moving out of Africa. You remember for so many years they taught us that there were these little monkey people in Africa, and they were there for 100,000 years, and then they kind of spread out and stuff. Well, that center in Africa has been moving north at the rate of about 20 to 50 miles a year for the last several decades, because of the things that they're finding in different places. Here's one of the LiDAR shots that showed them that underneath that jungle that was called, especially in South America, the green hell, where nobody could find anything. You guys heard about Indiana Jones, right? He's totally based on real people, right? Many different expeditions went down and tried to find those ancient civilizations down there, and sometimes they found stuff, and sometimes they didn't, but lots of people died, right? They were all right. This is science. This is not a guess. This is not my opinion. With the LiDAR, we can see all of those ancient civilizations under the surface of the green and under the surface of the dirt. This is something where they can see it under the surface of the green. This is not a building. This is not a house. This is a civilization with roads that go out hundreds of miles in every direction, with housing and with palaces and with things, all under the surface of these. Here's another shot. And of course, people just thought, well, this is just dirt and stuff. How did this entire civilization get buried under there? I don't know. There has to be some kind of a mechanism though, right? You don't have an effect without a cause. This shot covers hundreds of miles. Nearly 500 Mesoamerican monuments revealed by laser mapping, many for the first time, all over that continent in South America. Here are others that they just found in different places that nobody's ever investigated. Nobody's ever seen them. Nobody's ever chopped and dug their way down there to see what these things are. But the computers see them and designate them as being man-made objects. We use the same technology that we use on Mars to find out it's just a bunch of dirt, right? This is one of the Olmec heads. These are the oldest artistic representations that we find in South America. As far as the Olmecs, nobody knows who they were, right? Pre-Incan, pre-Aztec, pre-all of those. But frankly, there's folks like that that look like that around here today. I don't think it's as big a mystery as we make it out to be. Now, that thing's about, I think this one is 10 feet tall. That's why it's lasted. And as we dig down deeper there, we find older and older civilizations. But this is probably also the culture that built those original things that we're finding under the dirt, and possibly even things like Machu Picchu. We don't find any genetic evidence of their existence. No graves, no bodies, no nothing. But somebody with a hammer and a chisel made this thing. And he didn't make just one. There's thousands of these. That's Tenochtitlan. It's another amazingly complex structure in Mexico. Here's the size of another one of these compared to the man. These are all over South America. Being made of basalt makes it especially interesting because it's an incredibly hard rock. We don't exactly know how they carved this, especially with the technology of the time. But the reason we still find them is because they're buried under the earth, and every once in a while some farmer bumps into one and digs it up. Not that different than this, though, right? These civilizations knew each other. They interacted with each other. It's not that crazy, right? We make big heads sometimes. Human beings make big heads. Why don't you just admit it? My people have made big heads, right? We've got a mountain not too far from here with 4 big heads on it. We're very impressed by it. We go there and sing patriotic songs and eat hot dogs because we've got big heads made out of rock. We do these things because we all have a background in common. And of course, these are the biggest and we're said to be the oldest, But what was the oldest for 150 years? What was the oldest man-made structure on Earth? It's smaller than these and not as impressive, but it was said it had to be the oldest, right? Stonehenge, right? Because it's not in Egypt. I'm not a conspiracy theorist. I'm just saying why? Why that pile of stones rather than the 500 or 600 other hedges that we have around the earth that are made of rocks, right? They're literally on every continent on earth, and you can find just about one in just about every state of the United States. The United States also has ancient edifices and buildings. Tenochtitlan, again, just to give you some idea of the scale by seeing a human being on it. Where's this one at? Illinois. This is the largest one on the North American hemisphere. Of course, people have different theories about what its size was originally and how much bigger it was. There was one, at least in near the city of Chicago, that was larger than this, but they came with many trucks, especially in the 1920s and 1930s, and carried away the dirt to make houses and make downtown Chicago. They just tore it all down. Why do we know that it's? For many years, people were like, "That's just a hill sticking out of the grassland. It's nothing." Then they started to dig into it, and there's all these people in it. Oh, they're dead. They're not stuck. And there's support beams and pillars, and in looking through it, there was a civilization in Illinois that at the same time in about 1500 was larger than the entire cosmopolitan and metropolitan area of London, England. There were more people doing more things. It's just the European bias that's why we say, well, that's not a real city. Why not? Folks living around stuff is a city, right? But no, civilizations were thriving here at that time. This is a picture we took. We went to see it. It's a hill, right? It's not that impressive. It's pretty impressive up close. So you get into the genetic question because, hey, when I was a kid, the genetic question was not real. We didn't talk about it. We didn't think about it. We knew people were doing stuff with genes and trying to breed sheep and stuff, but it really wasn't that interesting. Now you can spit in a cup and send it off and they'll say, you're Irish, right? They'll know within reason where your people came just from looking into your genes, and we couldn't do that before. Now we can do it, and it's changing everything, because now we know where everybody came from, right? This is part of the haplogroup scale. You might have looked into this, or you might not have, where the different people come from. We know who people are related to. One of the things that Christians expected to find, and that they found, is everybody's related. There were no 2 lines of lineage that came from different animals. That didn't happen. You trace these things back, you're going to come to an original pair. One of the reasons is because we can trace the mother's line through the mitochondrial DNA, and we can trace the father's line through the paternal DNA. And you get different kinds of things from both. From the mother's line, you get like absolute certainty. Everybody doesn't know who their daddy is, but everybody knows who their mama is, and that's how that works, right? Through the fathers, you get variation consistency, right? Like you might be able to tell what color someone was from their father's paternal DNA. You can't really get that from the mother's, but you know who your mother was because there's things in common in that DNA that's a lock through history. So we can trace everybody in history back to a common mother. And it is not a monkey in Africa. And it's not that long ago, which has shaken a lot of people up. Remember, the only reason we said human beings were 300,000 or 400,000 years old was because we didn't have a mechanism for the existence of human beings. We recognize that we're all here, but we don't know how we got here. So how long would it take for human beings to form, just through natural processes of breeding, to become the kind of things they were now if they used to be monkeys? Well, it would probably take a few 100 million years, right? Unless that never happened at all. So anyway, we trace it back, and we're all related, and the center of these things tends to be this area, where they call K2, where interestingly, the Bible says the Garden of Eden was, and that human civilization started. He said that he started them where the rivers, the Euphrates and the other rivers came together, and that's where people came together, and that they went out from there, and that's where we're finding that all the different haplogroups descend from through time. Now, some people think, you know, they say this stuff, it's a little bit uncomfortable. Is it horribly racist to say that humanity didn't actually begin on the continent of Africa? I don't see what that has to do with it. They didn't come from Scotland, so I'm not disturbed, right? But in those same places, in those same areas, the cradle of civilization seems to have been near where modern-day Babylon was, and where all of the rivers came together, and where the book of Genesis kind of says God did his thing. That's where they seem to have came from and spread out everywhere. Here's something that makes people very uncomfortable, because we start to get to this American issue. Native Americans and that type of thing, we can trace all of the DNA now, right? And what we find out is that over the North American canvas, those people were not related to each other. The myth for a long time is there's one people, Native Americans. They're all related, and they spread out from there. Now we know some of them came from Asia, and some of them came from Russia, some of them came from Europe, some of them came from South America, some of them came from Polynesia, some of them came from Africa. In other words, the United States was inhabited by peoples from all over Earth. This also leads us to understand maybe why there was so much friction between the different groups, because they did not consider themselves to be related, and sometimes a different Indian tribe were just seen as an enemy with another language and another culture. They did not always like each other, right? And often went to war. But the main group that spans the entire northern part of North America, where did they come from in the greatest numbers? Anybody know? Russia. They're European. All of these things about European ancestry are just being reinterpreted now. You don't read a lot about it in the papers because everybody's terrified of being called a racist. But here's the thing. You go to Russia now, and it goes all the way through northern China and Mongolia. That really is where everybody said the people came from, right? I mean, they walked over that land bridge in Asia made of ice. And they were wearing skins and spears and stuff. Well, that probably never happened. What probably happened is they got on boats and they were wearing normal clothes, and they came over and they started a civilization that started in Alaska and moved through the entire continent. But other people came up from the south, and they were probably the descendants of Africans and Polynesians that populated that area that we call the Incans and the Aztecs and all of those people. If you go to South America today, and even the south part of Mexico, you find about 30 different languages from the ancient Indian cultures at that time. It's not one identifiable group, and frankly, they don't all speak Spanish. They're different people from different times. And here's the thing. DNA don't lie. We can interpret it very poorly, but it doesn't lie. We're all related. We all come from the same places. Another time I'll do a lecture on where white people in Scandinavia come from, because it's very disturbing to them when they hear this stuff. Because there were no white monkeys in Scandinavia that gave birth to a special race. They're just folks that came from other places and settled in that area, right? I'm already getting disturbed looks on this lecture. So here, this area of Asia, that a lot of it became modern-day China, but you have to remember that China is continually increasing in size and mass. China takes land from everybody and says, oh, this is China, right? It wasn't always this size, it wasn't always this shape. And North and South China were traditionally ethnically and linguistically different people with different cultures, attitudes, and atmospheres. So, this is a hill in modern-day Turkey called Göbekli Tepe. Tepe just means the hill. And as usually happens in situations like this, there was a goat farmer. And the goat farmer's out there with his goats. And there's this one place where he used to have lunch where a rock came out of the ground. And he starts digging at it, and apparently it's a big rock. So he gets some other people and family, and they start digging at it. They can't get to the bottom of this rock. Eventually they get the university, and the government comes in, and they start digging at this rock. And eventually, they find this. Göbekli Tepe. It's said to be the oldest found civilization in the history of the world. Right now, the scientists and the archaeologists are dating it at 7 to 11,000 BC. Now, for those of you that grew up thinking that 5,000 BC year old Stonehenge was the oldest man-made creation, or that 2 to 4,000 year old pyramids were the oldest thing, this blows them out of the water, right? And look at the size and the scale of this place. Oh, I guess I don't have more slides for that. Look at the little people at the end. So what they also found is this, that this place that they found under this hill is just one of about 50 complexes as it goes out. In other words, it's not just a temple, and it's not just a city. It's an entire civilization that goes out for hundreds of miles in every direction. It kind of makes you paranoid about hills, right? Everything we keep talking about is a hill or a mountain that everybody thought was just a mountain, and they dig into it and they find out it's a structure. Now that sounds a little weird to folks, but that's how they find stuff, right? That's how this is happening all over the earth. So this entire thing was buried. Those columns that you see at the bottom, they're over 30 feet high. They're not small. They're very big. So as they were digging down just to get to the bottom of it, takes an incredible amount of manpower and digging and money and labor. So finally, the Turkish government put enough money into it where they found out it's not only one. If you look at the back on the right, there's 2. And if you look at the back on the left, there's 3. And these things have different carvings on them and different kinds of things about their culture and about their time. But the dominant theory until like last year, finally somebody gave up the ghost on this. For more than 20 years, they've been saying this. They got their dirt and they buried this entire civilization by hand. No, I'm not kidding. This was the dominant theory, that this entire civilization that goes on for miles in every direction, the only way it could have gotten down under that much dirt. Here's the thing. You guys have left things outside, right? You ever leave your leaf blower outside? And then you find it in the spring and it's half covered with dirt? Eventually, if you left it there for a couple years, there's nothing left but a cord, right? I'm not saying that doesn't happen. But it does not happen to civilizations, especially that are inhabited through time. There has to be some mechanism for this entire civilization being buried. And here, so they started digging in other places and other hills, and they find all of them are like cities. This entire area, which is known as the center, see how the Euphrates River is there? That's known as the historical biblical birthplace of civilization. They're all cities made of stone, buried under the earth for thousands and thousands of years. Every one of these spots is a city or a town that they found beneath the earth. And, because there's interesting things where there were some of these places where they found something, they found some pots or something like that, and they dig down 5 or 6 feet, and they didn't find anything, so they gave up. They went back to some of those sites, dug another 2 feet, and found an entire city. But because some of those columns are 30 feet high, do you know how much dirt it takes to bury a city 30 feet under the ground? It's an interesting question, isn't it? And the theory was, we don't know of any mechanism. They know it's not volcanic because that's easy to find out, right? So they must have buried it on purpose. I'm serious. Google this. You're going to see that all the scientists are sitting around talking about how long it took them to bury this, one basket of dirt at a time. And I'm just sitting there thinking, this is ridiculous, right? This makes me want to go back to the aliens. Maybe they are good at burying stuff. So many of these, and they're not done yet. And they haven't dug it all up yet. They've just dug what they can do. Here's another thing. We keep finding things in archaeology around the world. This is from one of the temples in India. You guys have seen these ornate ancient stone temples that they have thousands of years old. They've got some that are 4,000 and 5,000 years old. But they keep having pictures like this on there. Do you guys know what that is? That's what I think it is, right? But they keep finding like dinosaurs and other things that these people never could have experienced and never knew. And there don't seem to be any of these or any bones in this area. And they keep finding these kind of carvings in their carvings on the sides of the temples. Triceratops, Stegosaurus. It's almost like they had seen these things. I don't know. Here's some others that are very interesting. I don't see any of these around today. In case you think to yourself, yeah, but they were carving majestic, strange, mythological creatures. Well, first of all, those other creatures are not mythological. They're things that we find in the dirt. And also, these people were realists. You can tell by the fact that so much of their carvings are erotica that they were very realist in their things they did. They tended to carve things to look like things that actually existed around them. Okay, now the Temple Mount is where the temple, where's my temple picture? The temple that was built in Israel. For a long time, since the Dome of the Rock issue happened and the Muslims built a mosque on top, for over 100 years it's been very difficult or impossible to get pictures of the inside of this to see what's going on there archaeologically. But just recently, several people, because now we have these things called smartphones, so even though you can't bring a camera, you can sneak a phone in, have gone into the Dome of the Rock. This is the place where the Ark of the Covenant stood. This is the Holy of Holies, where the priest would do his sacrifice and go in with his bowl of blood. And when you look at it, frankly, it's not very impressive. And if you think about the Bible's narrative about this place, is it supposed to be? Or was all of this destroyed and Jesus said not one stone will be left on another? And everything was taken away. But one of the things that you see that's very interesting is the different grooves that are in the top of the rock. The places where they would have set the different implements are still there. And the place where they would have set the Ark of the Covenant is still there. And the place where they would have had the lampstand is still there. So it does look like we would have expected it to look because it was supposed to be just a rock, right? So this is where the Ark of the Covenant would have been, within this temple, and this is what that would have looked like by an artist rendering at that time. And it's all still there. One of the interesting things is, when the Bible says something, it's usually still there. And all you have to do is walk over there and find it. The Bible's different than other books. It's not trying to tell fairy tales. It's trying to tell history tales. And so when we find things, we find them exactly the way they should have been. There's a story in chapter 9 of John. And Jesus and his disciples asked him, Master, who did this? Who did sin, this man or his parents, that he was born blind? And Jesus answered, Neither hath this man sinned, nor his parents, but that the works of God should be made manifest in him. I must work the works of him that sent me, while it is day. The night comes when no man can work. As long as I am in the world, I am the light of the world. When he had thus spoken, he spat on the ground and made clay from the spittle, and he anointed the eyes of the blind man with clay. He said to him, Go, wash in the pool of Siloam, which by interpretation means the one who is sent. He went his way, therefore, and washed, and came back seeing. And the neighbors, therefore, and they which before had seen him, that he was blind, said, Is this not he that sat and begged? Some said, This is he. And others said, He is like him. But he said, I am he. Therefore they said to the man, How were thine eyes opened? He answered and said, A man that is called Jesus made clay and anointed mine eyes, and said to me, Go wash in the pool of Siloam. And I went and washed and received my sight. So there's an interesting thing about this. You know, for hundreds and hundreds of years, there was no pool of Siloam. It's just not there. It's one of the things that led some people to say, you know, these are just fairy stories. They just made up a name that sounded like something Jesus would have said and that type of thing. And there's a traditional place where they thought it was, but if you look down here at the bottom, it's all fields and grass, and you know, they do farming on it. There's no such place. It was supposed to be right in the center of the city. But they did find a place that they called the Pool of Siloam. You could go there and you could get your Siloam keychain and that kind of thing. And you know, people would, from what they say, people would pee in it and that kind of stuff. But it's not a place that would be the way that the ancient Jews talked about it, a large pool where people would go and wash, and where the sick would go and wash and get back their health and that kind of thing. This isn't that. It almost kind of looks like a sewer passage, right? I mean, would you drink out of that? I don't think you would. So even today, there's signs up here, and people sell like T-shirts for the Pool of Siloam. Well, there was this guy that took the Bible very seriously, which many times biblical archaeologists do not. And he's kind of like, this isn't exactly the right place, and it doesn't look the way the Bible or the extra biblical documents talk about this, right? So he says, well, where does this water go? And he puts like blue dye in the water and that kind of thing. He tries to trace the water through the city to where it comes out. This is an artist's rendition of what they thought the Pool of Siloam probably looked something like by the ancient descriptions. Here's another one, an artist's rendition. But you know, obviously it was big and it was a little bit magnificent, and hundreds of people historically could be in it at the same time. So he traces it down, and where this water comes out, it comes out in this little stagnant place. Now really none of these steps were visible. Just the water was bubbling out here. Do you see how deep that dirt is? 4 or 5 feet. People had dug there for the Pool of Siloam before, but when they got down to like 3 or 4 feet, they gave up because, you know, it's just dirt and digging is hard, right? And there is a field there and an orchard and olive trees, but they got permission from the guy that owned it, and they kept digging. And they kept digging. And now they have found and unearthed almost the entire Pool of Siloam. He won't let them go any farther. He owns that property, right? You see how deep it is under. But the water is still coming out naturally. When you have something like a pool in the ancient world, you don't have chlorine in a pool boy that comes by and spices it up for you, right? And you got to have running water, otherwise it turns what? Green and fetid. So the water had to come through. The water is still coming through, and they have found with almost certainty the Pool of Siloam. Look how big it actually is. And it goes all the way across that field to the left where that dirt is. If they take out all that dirt, that pool will refill and the Pool of Siloam will be back. And so, you know, this is just an interesting thing where the Bible talks about something, and it talks about it as if it's history, because it takes itself very seriously. And people say there was probably no such place and that type of thing, until some guy with a shovel finds it, right? And you can go there now, and they have tours through it. They're uncovering more of it every year. The guy that owns the field is really mad because he knows that if it's declared a historic site, he's going to lose his field, right? So they're being very nice with him, and the water fills up that bottom area there. But it's generally agreed upon by all the scholars. This is the pool. The pool that we've been looking at for 700 years, that was never the pool. This is the pool. Here's what it looks like from the other view. That's the place on the end where you can now get new keychains and T-shirts from the new improved Pool of Siloam. This is from Jericho. Now, you guys probably know that Jericho is the oldest continually inhabited city in the world that we know of, that people have always lived in the whole time. Like that Göbekli Tepe, it's not inhabited. It was under the ground. This place has been inhabited, but there's always been this issue of the walls fell down and the towers and the Israelites invaded and that type of thing. Well, you know, there are a couple scholars over there that took it seriously. Sometimes they have to be quiet about the fact that they're using the Bible as their basis for finding things. Because the way it works in biblical archaeology is if you find something, fine. But if you find something because the Bible said it, then it's not true. So they go and they start digging at this place where there was this outcroppment, and they dig down, and look at how deep this is under the ground. They had to dig 30 feet just to get to the top of the old walls and the old towers of old Jericho. But it's still there. It was just under the earth. Here's the thing. Nobody has any good reason to build a 30-foot tall tower under the ground. It's just not done. They said it took, probably 11 years of constant manpower to make this tower. You can go inside it. It's empty on the inside. It can be used for defensive purposes, and it's all there in Jericho. It's just way down under the ground. It's almost an absurd thing. How do you get a tower under the ground? What's the mechanism for that? I'm not going to do that with mastodons, I'll tell you, right? But also, why do you build one? Why do you build walls and towers under the earth? I'm not saying I know the mechanism either, but the walls in many places, they fell out. They're digging up the bricks that have fallen. They're just 30 feet under the ground. In 2 Timothy 3:16, it says this: "Continue in the things you have learned and have been assured of, knowing from whom you have learned them, and that as from a child you have known the Holy Scriptures, which are able to make you wise for salvation through faith in Jesus Christ. All Scripture is given by inspiration of God and is profitable for doctrine, for reproof, for correction, and for instruction in righteousness, that the man of God may be perfect, thoroughly equipped for every good work." So I know I say things, in this kind of a lecture that are frankly meant to be crazy. And what I mean by that is out of sorts with the way that people have said you must interpret this information. But if you went back through the last few hundred years and you had differed with the people's interpretation of things, you would have been right about 95% of the time. We believe almost nothing that they believed about the world 500 or 1,000 years ago. Even today, while technology and things are advancing, the Bible hasn't changed at all. And I have found that it has been right on everything 100% of the time. The Bible's not actually making wild, crazy claims. It's making very credible claims, and it sometimes makes historical claims about people, places, and things that hold up very well under the white-hot light of science and history. And that's the end today. I'll save the other 300 slides for another time. Just kidding. Any questions or thoughts? Michael, would you mind praying for us? We'll close. Amen. Thank you for coming, folks.